From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And joining us today, K-State's Sally Davis and Randy Phebus. They'll tell about the new research initiative they'll be leading, which will study how to effectively control the spread of COVID-19 in our nation's meat and poultry processing facilities. This work supported by a new $1 million grant from the USDA. Also today from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen returns, this time to take up weed control laws and how the courts have interpreted those over the years. He'll highlight the extent of requirements on landowners under noxious weed control statutes. And awaiting with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, right here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today. Well, the intrusion of COVID-19 in our society has been quite obvious in recent months. In the U.S. meat packing plants, that caused a great upheaval, as you know, this past spring, and it served as a catalyst for research that's about to embark here at Kansas State University, looking into ways of mitigating that virus in our meat processing facilities. Joining us now, two of the individuals who are among a team of researchers at K-State who will look at this. Leading it is an experimental pathologist out of the College of Veterinary Medicine, Sally Davis, and one of her co-investigators in this is Randy Phebus, who is a food scientist here at Kansas State University. Randy, we'll start with you, and you work so diligently with packing plants, have in the past. This was something entirely different when COVID set in, right?
Yes, absolutely. We do a lot of food safety work with these companies, and we have for many years now. But this is a different situation where we have employees side by side in the plants that are transmitting virus from one another and then taking it home to the rest of their community. So it's a very different public health situation than what we have with just our normal food safety type work that we normally do.
The idea behind this research, Sally, is to figure out ways of mitigating the virus in those packing plant settings?
That's correct, Eric. From the point of view of what we know about the virus already, there are some unanswered questions which fall in the basic research area in terms of how to measure it in different surface areas, how to look at it in terms of where it might be harbored within an intricate and complex environment like the meat processing plants. And then after that, we need to look at how current approaches for sanitation and disinfection in those environments are efficacious or non-efficacious under certain circumstances. In order to do that, we're combining both basic virology research along with all of our applied research knowledge as to how these processing plants work.
Is there something, Randy, about the mere setup of a packing plant, though, that might contribute to the virus and its activity?
Well, and that's a big part of what we're going to be investigating in this grant. But the answer to that is yes. First of all, is these plants are packed tight with employees, so in close proximity. But outside of that, there's a lot of things that are different. For instance, the buildup of organic residues, fats and meats and proteins and stuff. We don't know how the virus survives or maintains its infectivity during that. But if you look at a meat processing plant, you've got chilled conditions, which is quite different than the average home or the average environment that most people would find themselves in. So we've got refrigeration refrigeration. We got really heavy airflow, directional airflow. These plants move a lot of air. But then we've also got on the harvest side of meat and poultry operations, you've got warm, humid conditions. So the conditions in a meat plant kind of span the gamut. So to understand, the systematic aspect of movement of the virus, survival of the virus, and it maintaining its infectivity, which Sally can talk much more about, these are really key questions to ask. And the industry people, yes, they are getting a lot of guidance right now from government and from scientists, but they are doing everything under their power to try to understand and then control the virus. But it's kind of like walking into a dark room. Where do you go first? And so we're supposed to be helping them figure that out.
And Sally, where do you go first, practically speaking, with this research? By the way, didn't mention on the support of a $1 million grant from the USDA. So how do you attack these multiple questions?
Well, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we look at the extant research that's been done largely within hospital environments and some other environments that consumers are in. And we look at what aspects of that are helpful and answer immediate questions for the meat and poultry processing industry. Then we look for the gaps, and some of those gaps were mentioned by Randy. The proximity of these employees is much higher, much closer to each other than you would see in many other environments. Unlike many other industries that shut down during the pandemic, this one continued. So it's the leading example of an industry where people work very closely to each other within an environment that, as Randy mentioned, has some very interesting characteristics. We're finding out that this virus can stay stable on frozen surfaces, which is not unexpected given the type of virus it is. We are also finding out interesting things. We thought at first that perhaps the higher the humidity, the happier the virus would be. There's recent research that's published that says the contrary. So we'll start with all of this existing research, and then we'll specifically design experiments that fill in the gaps and then allow us to specifically look at conditions that are of relevance to the meat and poultry industry. The work that comes out of this is generalizable then to other industries, but specifically tackles some of the issues at hand that are the points of pain for this industry.
Importantly, you will be using the facilities and the capabilities of the Biosecurity Research Institute here at K-State to allow you to investigate these things, right?
Yes, absolutely. The safety of our research team comes first in terms of this type of work. We will be doing it at Biosafety Level 3, which is a form of high containment. And when we're working with the viruses, particularly when we look at aspects of aerosolization, we will add in even more layers of protection such that we can still do our work and get accurate samples within a pilot processing environment, but be safe at all times within that environment. That's only possible within the facility we have here. And we position that within the USDA grant accordingly. We have not only the BSL-3 facility here, but we have a BSL-3 agriculture facility. And in addition to that, thanks to previous work by Randy's team, we actually have industry standard meat and poultry processing equipment in our facility that we can arrange in realistic arrangements and simulate what it might be like on a line, right down to directional airflow and those types of things we just mentioned.
Well, this project is targeted toward COVID-19, what it's brought to bear in the industry. Randy, as you, Sally, and all of those who are contributing to this embark on this research, could you foresee that the things you look into in the terms of sanitation, worker positioning, and such could be beneficial for other potential novel diseases on down the line?
Well, I don't doubt that at all. What we find out for COVID is going to be, melded into good manufacturing practices that these plants will use day in and day out for years to come, in all likelihood. I will say that the work that we're doing as far as validating current cleaning and sanitation practices and things like that. We're not going out and trying to develop brand new technology. We're validating what's already approved because we need immediate solutions to use. So if we can help them pick one or two or three different ways of better disinfecting, for instance, then that's a big win for us and for them. I also wanted to add, you mentioned that this is a $1 million USDA grant that we've gotten, but we have also gotten matching funds from the Kansas NBAF transition funds to help us with our very sophisticated equipment needs that we are going to have for this project. And then we also have other companies who have really kicked in with support to help us with air sampling and to really not only provide the equipment, to provide some of the expertise that is going to really advance the project.
And as we're talking about those who are lending to this, it's worth mentioning as well that you've an advisory board made up of industry representatives keeping tabs on what's happening here, and that is literally a who's who of the meat and poultry processing industries, isn't it?
It sure is. I will say we've worked for many, many years with these same people, but these are vice president and senior director level people in some of our nation's largest meat and poultry manufacturing facilities. And they are going to be on a very active industry advisory board for this project. We will be basically on a weekly communication schedule with them. So it's not us just telling them what we're finding. It's going to be them telling us what is applicable and what's possible and what their biggest concerns are. Mm-hmm. So it's a project that's going to evolve and build on itself as we go along over the next 2 years.
And it becomes clear, Sally, in closing, this project is on the fast track, isn't it, as much as possible?
Yes. So we've specifically designed the project in terms of its flow and its project plan to have incremental releases of information. So we expect to have findings as soon as 3 or 4 months from now. And we will share those as they're available with our industry board. If we figure out a way to assay the virus in a new way that's generalizable to other questions, that needs to go out to the scientific community as well.
This is extraordinarily important work for the meat and poultry sectors in this country, and we're wishing you and your team all the best as you explore ways of improving the mitigation of COVID-19 at those facilities. Thanks to the both of you for joining us, and good luck in pushing forward with this. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Certainly. Thank you.
Joining us from the College of Veterinary Medicine here at K-State, an experimental pathologist, Sally Davis. She is the lead investigator in this project. And among those joining her is Randy Phebus, food safety researcher here at Kansas State University. Once more, on the strength of multiple grants, including a $1 million grant from the USDA, they'll be studying how to effectively control the spread of COVID-19 in meat and poultry processing facilities. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Stay with us.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Continuing on now on this Agriculture Today, a glance at weed control law, noxious weeds and otherwise, and the standards of liability when weeds are not controlled. It's our conversation once again with Roger McEowen. Roger, a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. He's with us every other Wednesday. Roger, we'll get into this in detail, but how often do these kinds of cases come along regarding weed control?
Well, that's a good question. There are a number of cases that are out there, and I frankly think a lot of what would be potential cases get settled before they get to court. If I were to guess, in terms of the way I measure questions I get from people, of course, tax is the main driver, and then estate planning, business planning, defense law, lease law, and then I'd have to put weed questions next.
Oh.
I get a lot of questions with respect to weeds. I know our county agents get a lot of questions concerning weeds. And so it is a big issue. It's important to agriculture to control these weeds, because obviously there's a big economic cost if you get a weed infestation in your crops.
And we'll spend the bulk of our time on the state noxious weed laws and the cases that have brought those into the fray. Just about every state has some form of noxious weed statute in place, does it not?
Yeah, every state does. I mean, we've got one state, New Hampshire, that calls it something different, but in essence, it's a noxious weed law. But you're right. Every state has a list of what they deem to be noxious weeds. And then the issue, it comes down to what are the listed weeds, what are not the listed weeds, what are the control issues, what happens if you've got those weeds present on your property, what are the procedures for getting rid of them. Then, you get issues with neighbors because you might have weeds that are in a fence line, or you have weeds that are in a ditch, along a public roadway or in a rail line. As a railroad comes through the property, or even on public land, and now it's spread over onto you. So you got all types of issues that can potentially get twisted in there.
Roger, though, what we often see are frictions between neighbors when noxious weeds sprawl out of control and cross fence lines or property lines and so forth. And there's been a spate of case law on this, has there not, or at least some rulings?
Yeah, there have been rulings all across the country on this. Let me focus just on a few of those that I think illustrate the point well. Most of the state noxious weed laws do not permit an individual that's injured, let's say, by the spread of a neighbor's noxious weeds onto their property. Most of the state statutes don't allow that person to recover civil damages for the spread of those weeds. But that doesn't prevent that person from suing to recover damages for the other party's negligence in allowing the weeds to overspread onto the adjoining property. For example, in South Dakota, their noxious weed law has been held not to prohibit a private nuisance action for damages caused by failure to control non-noxious weeds. Now, we have to always distinguish between noxious and non-noxious, because noxious weeds, there is a affirmative state law duty on the part of the landowner to control those weeds. Often we get into the non-noxious situation where there's no state law responsibility backed up by a potential fine for failing to control non-noxious weeds. And so it's just up between the landowners to deal with this issue. Well, you can get into some pretty serious economic damages if the spread of the either noxious or non-noxious weeds are serious enough. And the question is, if they're non-noxious, what can I do? Well, what I'm saying here is that most state statutes don't allow you to have a cause of action against somebody where their weeds, they're non-noxious, they're non-listed weeds, is spread over onto you. You've got to be able to show that it was their negligent conduct that caused harm, or they willfully, and the law would say wantonly, let their weeds get out of control with the express purpose of harming you. They did it deliberately. Now, that's next to impossible to prove that. But there was a South Dakota case back in 2003 that said that a farmer has a duty to use ordinary care in working their land. So good husbandry practices, good tillage practices, use good farming practices. And they didn't do it. In that case, they said that the injured neighbor could bring a nuisance action to determine whether the farmer, in that case, breached their duty of ordinary care in working their CRP land, their Conservation Reserve Program land. And that's where you see a lot of times some problems with weeds. It grows up in the CRP land, that set-aside land. And while they're supposed to control the weeds pursuant to the CRP contract, because they're not farming that ground, weeds tend to be a problem. And it may be non-listed weeds, but what I'm saying here is the case law reveals that weed issues can become serious enough that a neighbor could sue if they can prove damages and they can prove that here you weren't even complying with your CRP contract where you had an affirmative duty to control all types of weeds.
So the duty of ordinary care is a key phrase in all of this, but there was even a case, you say, where a landowner was sued even though they were attempting to, in fact, control noxious weeds, but the offended party said they went about it the wrong way, in effect.
Yeah, you don't want to get your combine out on a windy day and go combine Russian thistle and kochia, which is exactly what happened in a North Dakota case back in the 1990s. And doing that caused $80,000 of damages to the neighbor in terms of cleanup costs and reduced crop yields and costs for present and future weed control. And they sued. I mean, the parties wanted to solve this issue, but the one that had the weed issue went about it in the wrong way and created a worse problem. And the court said, well, you don't have a common law duty to control the natural spread of weeds that aren't noxious weeds, but you can still be liable because you were negligent in the way that you controlled those weeds. So you got to use your head about how you control the weeds. Don't create a bigger problem is what the court was saying in that case.
What about noxious weed growth in a fence line, especially one which would divide properties between owners? How are those handled?
Yeah, if it is a partition fence, that's a fence that's on the boundary, then let me give you an example, particularly in eastern Kansas, you can get pretty heavy vines that'll grow up in a fence right in the fence line and get twisted in the fence. And we've got a lot of these fences in particularly northeast Kansas where it gets pretty deep back in the woods and so forth. Well, if you want to rebuild a fence or clean that fence line out, then you've got vines that are coming from a neighbor over onto you. You've got weeds. You've just got an absolute mess. And if you can't resolve the issue with your neighbor, then that does invoke the ability to call in the fence viewers, which would be the county commissioners, to come and take a look at that. Now, commissioners deal with building and maintenance of fence, but weeds and vines in a fence line, that deals with maintenance. And so it would be in the purview of the county commissioners to come out and say who's responsible for controlling what and what portion of the weeds in that fence so that you can get it rebuilt, maintained, whatever you need to do. That would be within their jurisdiction to make that type of a determination.
To come back to, though, something that you brought up earlier, non-noxious weed control. And there's one very applicable situation here in Kansas having to do with volunteer wheat, and that has caused court action to be taken in recent years as well.
Yeah, the wheat streak mosaic virus, you talk about a virus that doesn't have any type of control measure. And basically the only cure is good farming practices and maybe changing the time at which wheat is planted, watching your harvest practices, and then tillage practices post-harvest to take care of that. But that is a problem in Kansas. In 2017, which was a bad year for it, the estimated loss was just about $77 million to the Kansas wheat crop. And you've got weather conditions that look like they're going to mix to create a big problem coming up soon with volunteer wheat. Mm-hmm. Well, we had a case back in the 1990s involving wheat streak mosaic virus and volunteer wheat and the spread of it. And because it's not a listed noxious weed, there is no affirmative duty to control it. And that's the point that the Kansas Court of Appeals made in 1997. There is no common law duty in Kansas to control volunteer wheat to prevent its spread. But good farming practices can go a long way in minimizing that damage. And I know it does cost a little bit more, and margins are really tight to non-existent. And that's been some of the pressure that's created the problems, that made the problem worse in western Kansas in recent years. So the state legislature in Kansas, session before last, will be kicking more of the responsibility for control of noxious weeds and back to the counties and give them more authority to designate what are noxious weeds in their particular county. That takes effect starting in 2021. We'll see if that helps the issue. I think that's a good approach because a weed issue in St. Francis, Kansas may not be the same weed issue in Baxter Springs just because of the vast geographic distance between the two locations in the state. So putting this more on the counties to come up with their weed control issues, I think, is a good approach, and we'll see how that plays out in the future in Kansas.
Roger has a write-up on this very matter in his blog series. This was dated September the 5th on issues with noxious and other weeds and seeds. You can find that at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. And Roger, always a pleasure. Many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric.
He is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Once more, we're glad to have you along with us. Eric Atkinson here. Now today's agricultural news headlines. In brief, these courtesy in part of DTN. Payments under the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program have increased to just shy of $10 billion, $9.9 billion to be exact, as of last Sunday. That includes $4.9 billion for livestock, $2.6 billion for non-specialty crops, $1.7 billion for dairy, and $647 million for specialty crops. Now, payments for cattle make up the biggest share at $4.2 billion out of the $4.8 billion paid out for livestock. Payments for hogs at $597 million, and the $2.6 billion for non-specialty crops breaks down like this: $1.7 billion for corn, $499 million for soybeans, $255 million for upland cotton. And the payouts by state have shifted slightly. Iowa, still the top state at $961 million, followed by Nebraska, California, Minnesota, and Texas and Wisconsin, all eclipsing $500 million or more. It's not clear how much the totals for CFAP will increase in coming reports, as the sign-up deadline was last Friday, September the 11th. The Government Accountability Office has released a report now showing that producers in southern states, especially those who grow cotton, received higher market facilitation program payments than farmers of other commodities and specialty crops around the country. A pair of Midwest Democrat senators have pointed to the report to argue that producers who grow specialty crops, smaller producers, and Midwestern farmers in general did not get their fair share of MFP payments, which were meant to offset the trade losses during the president's tariff battles over the past 3+ years. The report comes after MFP has basically shut down, as the USDA has moved on to the CFAP program and is preparing to announce rules for CFAP 2. The White House Office of Management and Budget now reviewing the second round of CFAP aid, by the way. On a per-acre basis now, the GAO states that Georgia farmers averaged $119 per acre. The top 10 states for payments per acre were weighted heavily toward southern states. In order, they were Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, and then Illinois. Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan criticized how the USDA came up with the payment rates and which crops were included in the MFP. Stabenow's complaints against USDA's handling of the program have continued. She says this GAO report confirms her criticisms of the USDA's handling of MFP. And Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio criticized that cotton producers received the higher payment for their market price, 40%, according to the GAO, compared to soybean farmers who received 25%, even though, says Brown, every third row of soybeans typically goes to the Chinese market. Now, the USDA's response to this states that MFP was not designed to be a general farm bill program. It was also designed, says the USDA, to make sure that farmers who are most impacted receive the most aid. For example, the department says cotton and sorghum received higher MFP payments because they had significantly higher trade damages per unit of production compared to other MFP commodities. And the USDA goes on to say that MFP payments are based on trade damage and not on regions and farm size. The department notes that the Midwest received more than 68% of the funds in the program, with the top 5 states for payments being Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Texas, and Kansas. And the World Trade Organization said yesterday that the Trump administration tariffs on Chinese goods totaling more than $200 billion are illegal under the rules of that global trade body. In its decision, the WTO ruled against the Trump administration's argument that China had engaged in practices harmful to U.S. interests on issues including intellectual property theft, technology transfer, and innovation. The ruling, in theory, would allow China to impose retaliatory tariffs tariffs on billions worth of U.S. goods if the process is completed. However, the U.S. government can appeal the decision. Now, the administration has justified the sanctions under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, commonly used by the government to impose sanctions, the U.S., arguing that China's actions have amounted to state-sanctioned theft and misappropriation of U.S. technology, intellectual property, and commercial secrets. The WTO panel ruled that the U.S. measures violated long-standing international trade rules because they only applied to products from China, and that the U.S. had not adequately substantiated its claim that the Chinese products hit with those extra duties had benefited from the allegedly unfair Chinese practices. Well, a global need for quality breeding stock and genetics is creating marketing opportunities for Kansas producers. Scarlett Higgins tells us here to help meet this demand, the Kansas Department of Agriculture is soon hosting a webinar focused on all that's involved in exporting livestock and genetics.
The Livestock Export webinar is designed for seed stock producers, allied industry, or anyone interested in learning more about exporting livestock or livestock genetics. It will be held October 1st via Zoom from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Participants will hear from industry experts about export strategies, as well as gain a better understanding of export financing and regulatory requirements. The webinar also will highlight technical information required to enter the export market and tools needed to take advantage of global market opportunities. Exports are an important part of the Kansas economy. In 2019, more than $3.8 billion of agricultural goods were shipped around the globe to 96 different countries. According to Kansas Secretary of Agriculture Mike Beam, this educational seminar is a great way to expand opportunities for communities and small businesses and help build upon rural prosperity across the state. He said agricultural growth plays a big role in rural revitalization and the health of Kansas, as it directly contributes $46 billion to the economy. Registration for the Livestock Export webinar is free. For more information about the session or to register, go to agriculture.ks.gov. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And to slip in a quick reminder ahead of the break about the 2020 K-State Beef Stocker Field Day, it will be held virtually on Thursday, October the 1st. There are many details to cover on that field day, and you can find out more about those at ksubeef.org. Registration is free, but they're asking you to register online by September the 24th, if you could. Once again, this year's Beef Stocker Field Day virtually Thursday, October the 1st. Find out more at ksubeef.org. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
When we talked, he asked me what I could recommend to replace it with.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
This is ridiculous, funny, and absurd, especially for me who should know. I know some of the grandkids just laugh. I've tried to explain it to myself. I try to understand it. But I admit that for a moment I turned things around again when laying in bed. In my mind, I drove to my son's house near Canton. As landscape architect to whom the four corners are important, north, south, east, and west, I have no problem when I look at projects. Generally, I can orient myself quickly, and from there on, I can design or do what is required. But it seems that at Ian and Vicky's place out in the country, I get different vibes. Why it all of a sudden concerns me again is because when I called Ian a few weekends ago, he said that he had been busy with the tractor pulling out the big forsythia. They did not like it. It never bloomed, was too big, etc. So out it would come. The tractor was a great help, and it was a big shrub, filling the corner against the house. Now, stop there. I know exactly where the big shrub stands against the house in the inside corner. It's like a niche. It does not do what it is expected from it. When we talked, he asked me what I could recommend to replace it with. To answer that question, I need more information. In my mind, on one side a solid wall, on the other side the big picture window looking south. That would make it a hot corner. But wait, the picture window is not looking south. The picture window faces the long open driveway looking north. Am I sure? And this is where it starts to get ridiculous. So to orient myself, I drive to them. On I-70, we go west to 15. On 15, I go south. I go south until I turn off to go to Roxbury. I'm driving west again. In Roxbury, I slow down and go south again past Maxwell Game Preserve. Now I have to watch it. As soon I'll go left again on a county gravel road. Hold on. That is left, soon past the game preserve. Then I turn right into their long driveway and pull up in front of their house. To the left, I would see the shrub in the corner. So the front door faces east. Maybe if I lived in the house and woke up with daylight, the four corners would have been clearly imprinted. But as I drove, I figured it out again. And the grandsons laugh. One reason I stay confused is that we used to drive south on 15 until 56 and then turn north at Canton, a quiet, sleepy town. Going north, we had to turn right on the county road and then the right again to the long driveway up to the house. If you are confused now, you know how I feel. The difference is that I'm not often confused, and that is the question. What confuses me? There are not that many landmarks, but many more than the early settlers had to guide their prairie schooners across the endless grass. Of course, the question is still, Dad, what shrub or shrubs would you recommend for that now empty corner facing north, protected from the west and open to the east? A northeast exposure protected from the west, but a cold northwest wind will blast around the corner, and so will blowing snow. Hardy shrubs are spirea and Korean lilac, but there are viburnums and so much more. There are shrubs with fall color. What one could do is plant a redbud in the corner and place lower shrubs in front. I could easily spend a lot of money in that corner. Then to think to get a forsythia started, all it takes is 10 or 12 dormant sticks and take care of them. If planted in spring while still dormant, the bud tends to break easily. Yes, hot, dry summer can play havoc with the rough planting, but generally a few of the 12 will take off. I plant the small sticks in a well-prepared planting hole, and in a year or two, I have a new shrub. Screening what needed screening, or just as background in the border. But I must admit, it's fun to walk the rows of shrubs and ornamental trees in a nursery and make your selection. It's very tempting. I will call Ian and ask if my orientation is correct. And I will ask him what they envision as being a plant selection for that corner. I know they have a feeder standing there which attracts a lot of birds. Because of that, a small open tree like redbud may be a very good start. It's a tree birds hop onto and wait their turn at the feeder. Ground birds can scratch and clean the fallen seeds. I wonder if there might be a magnetic rock buried in the ground, throwing me off. The grandsons laugh.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. And that'll do it for our Wednesday edition. From time to time, we like to remind you about our podcast service. If you'd go to agtoday.net, you'll find each day's broadcast stored there for your listening at your leisure. You can also find out about the automatic download of the podcast, how to arrange that for your mobile device. agtoday.net. On tomorrow's broadcast, we'll visit with K-State's Rich Llewellyn. The Department of Agricultural Economics at K-State has just updated its projections on ARC and PLC program payments based on the USDA's latest grain price forecasts. We'll talk with Rich about those, plus more, right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.